I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, I would like to thank the Albanian presidency. I would like to thank the Albanian presidency for choosing this very pertinent topic for today's meeting. Unfortunately, Ms. Sibuska, one of our briefing, is talking about sexual violence that Nina Denisov, the Ukrainian ombudsman, talked about. And this is egging on the Ukrainian propagandists, people who just at any cost, irrespective of the truth, want to demonize Ukraine. Mr. Cohen and his fantastic tales show that the Nazis in Ukraine have become linked with Russian hackers. Our hackers, through remotely, seem to be pushing Ukraine into being Nazis and fueling Ukrainian nationalism. Is this the case? The ideology of hatred and violence inter alia against one's own people is the basis of the ideology for the Ukrainian people. This was caused by the horrific attack, crimes being committed by the Kiev regime against its own people. This is one of the key reasons for the current crisis in Ukraine. We should recall that Russia already raised these issues in the Security Council in May last year. We had an informal ARIA meeting on neo-Nazism and radical nationalism in Ukraine. Today's meeting is a good opportunity to get to the bottom of why the current Ukrainian leadership and the hate-filled rhetoric are essentially inextricably linked to each other. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine, as a sovereign country, just like other post-Soviet republics, had the opportunity to build an independent statehood. Ukraine had total free will and could make its geopolitical choices. However, the choice of the elites who came to power, not without prompting of the foreign Ukrainian diaspora, was in favor of out-and-out nationalism, the glorification of its legacy, and credit going to Hitler's accomplices, the leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. This, quite naturally, determined the path taken by the new Ukraine vis-à-vis its neighbors. We're trying to be convinced that neo-Nazism and nationalism in Ukraine is a marginal phenomenon. In actual fact, ultranationalism is the mainstream policy of the Ukrainian authorities. We don't have time to lay out the genesis of Ukrainian nationalism and give quotes of all of its roots. We just want to say that one of the founding fathers, Dmitry Vorontsov, put together the theory of integration, which is something that he took from Charles Maurras, the Frenchman, who in 1919 set up a unit of nationalist. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I'll just say that this is based on the ideology of hatred, and it is in favor of a caste-based society, the immoral achievement of aims through brutality and cruelty, and the depression of minorities, or the active minority, vis-à-vis the overall majority, and the prevalence of Ukraine and that prevailing. Now, of course, all this means hatred towards Russians and Russian people. This is something that's prevailing. We will try and find a means of conveying all of the details of the Ukrainian nationalist thought. Nikolai Mikhnovsky, one ideologist of Ukrainian nationalism, whose statue is throughout Ukraine, bequeaths his followers with the concept Ukraine is for Ukrainians, the essence of which is as follows. All people are brothers, but obscene curse words for Moscovites, Poles, and Jews, these are enemies of your people. That's the end of the quote. And for example, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army murdered hundreds of thousands of Poles, Jews, and Russians. Their cruelty caused repulsion even amongst the occupying Hitlerites. And we can be not surprised that there's a flourishing of anti-Semitism, racism, and Russophobia in Ukraine now. However, given the fact that when it became independent, Russians and Russian speakers were at least 60% of the population, as regards achieving its Russophobia agenda, the Ukrainian authorities had to bide their time. The denial and, in fact, the demonizing of the historical memory it shares with Russia, as well as hatred of everything Russian, was slowly introduced year after year. It's important to point out that in establishing a Russophobic Ukrainian nationalism was something the US and its Western allies were very interested in. They saw it as an excellent opportunity to cut the historic ties between Ukraine and Russia, as required by the relevant geopolitical constructions they had. As a result, the new statehood of the once multicultural Ukraine was modeled at the behest of the West, based on primitive Russophobia, so initially mixed in with an ideology of hatred. Ukraine, against its own national interests, instead of having genuine sovereignty, opted for an anti-Russian geopolitical project. Achieving this in the essentially Russian and Russian-speaking southeast of Ukraine was not easy. Indicative here, the statements of the well-known Russophobe and MP of the Verkhovna Rada, who was there for several terms, Irina Faryan. She repeatedly said, I quote, "All Russians are mentally retarded." Right after the Maidan anti-constitutional coup, this Russophobe, who in the Ukrainian parliament was in charge of linguistic and humanitarian issues, moaned in one interview, 14% of people in our country are Ukrainians who have said that their native language is Russian. These are 5 million degenerate Russians and they need to be saved, even going as far as isolating people who don't speak Russian, end of quote. I'm providing you with this quote so that you understand the treatment that Russian-speaking inhabitants of Ukraine encountered after the 2014 Maidan coup. The first steps of the Kiev junta was to have direct incitement to violence against the Russian-speaking population. The entire population was divided up into first and second-class citizens. Second-class citizens were deemed those who consider themselves ethnic Russians and also Russian speakers. A whole raft of laws depriving them of their rights was adopted. All the years after Maidan, the Kiev authorities, with the assistance of Russophobes such as Irina Faryan, who I mentioned, cultivated hatred, and this was put as a state policy, hatred to Russians, to the Russian culture, language, and to civilization, and even to those who speak it, including citizens of Ukraine. People who were against the illegal Maidan authorities were dubbed by Kiev as terrorists, separatists, puppets, and monsters. Intolerance accompanied by violence became the calling cards of the Kiev regime. I'll give you an example of a statement by an MP, the then mayor of Dnipropetrovsk, Boris Filatov, in March 2014, in his daily work in the Dnipropetrovsk administration. I quote, "In my opinion, there's nothing bad about expanding autonomy of Crimea and providing the Russian language the status of a state language. This will help to avoid an escalation of tension and will preserve Ukraine. However, we need to give these scum any such promises, guarantees, and make any concessions. But hang them, we need to hang them later." End of quote. Those weren't just empty threats. Suffice to recall the burning alive of Russian activists in Odessa in May 2050, 50 of them. The inhabitants of long-suffering Donbass are acutely aware of this. In August 2014, the pro-Maidan journalist Boris Butkiewicz called people in Donbass superfluous people. And I quote, "Donbass is not just a depressed region. There's an insane number of unnecessary people there. In the Donetsk region, there's about 4 million people and no less than 1.5 million superfluous people," end of quote. And with calls to bring Russians to their knees, to thrash the Ruskies, to piss on the Russians. And I do apologize for this wrong language, but this is a direct quote. It didn't stop there. With the support of the West, the Kiev authorities decided to put these into practice. And in 2014, Turchinov and then Poroshenko, instead of engaging in a dialogue with the Russian culture and language in Ukraine, attacked its own people and the Russian-speaking population of Donbass, giving an order on airstrikes and bombing of civilians. he clearly made it obvious what destiny awaited the people of Donbass. And I quote, "We're going to have work, they won't. We'll have pensions, they won't. We'll support people, children and pensioners, they won't have any support. Our children will go to school and preschool, and their children will cower in basements. That is how we will win this war," end of quote. And in 2014, the MP of the Verkhovna Rada from the Svoboda Freedom Party, Irina Farion, stated her aim of being in the Verkhovna Rada as destroying Moscow. This is why we live. This is why we've been born to this world, in order to destroy Moscow, to destroy not just the Moscow scum, the Moskale, but the black hole on European security, that we need to wipe them off the map. Vladimir Zelensky, who was still a comedian at the time, speaking at a concert for fighters of the nationalist battalions engaged in punitive operations of Kiev against Donbass, deliriously cried out, "Guys, we bow down to you. You protect us from this scum." End of quote. Once he became president, he didn't change what he was saying. He declared in November 2021, as to the inhabitants of Donbass, and I quote, "There are people who are actual people, but not everybody represents people. There are people who are non-people. That's what I think," end of quote. Someone who's complying with his leader is the advisor to the president, Mikhail Podolyak, who calls the people in DPR and LPR, and I quote, "dirty, despicable bandits, tiny dwarfs who are totally superfluous waste," end of quote. The Minister for Social Policy of Ukraine, Andriy Reva, in April 2019 said, regarding the people of Donbass, "don't feel sorry for them at all. I feel sorry for the soldiers and officers and their families who were killed by these rascals, these scum." I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that this is not just what was said by individuals and marginal radicals. These are senior leaders in the country. Just like their idols in the Third Reich, the Ukrainian nationalists see a solution to the Donbass issue in liberating the area from people. In 2019, the former MP of the Verkhovna Rada and a participant in the punitive operations in Donbass, Mr. Semyenko, said, "In my understanding, Ukraine must have a strategy to depopulate Donbass," end of quote. And this didn't just remain on paper. This is being enacted in practice by national battalions like Azov, Aidar, and others, whose shelling of residential neighborhoods in Mariupol, Kharkov, and Severodonetsk has been witnessed by hundreds and hundreds of people. One can only act like that if one, with all one's heart, hates both the Donbass residents and the Ruskies people. From these recent revelations of Mr. Poroshenko, we realize that the package of measures on the Minsk agreements, the implementation of which, in line with Resolution 2202, the Council desperately tried to achieve, was something that Ukraine never intended to implement. Ukraine just used it to drag things out to allow for military preparations against Donbass and Russia. It did so with the connivance of our Western colleagues, using time here for new Russophobia actions and projects, including the absolutely discriminatory law about Russian language, the persecution of the Russian media, the persecution and murder of Russian-speaking politicians, journalists, and public figures. In the post-Maidan years, dozens of them, if not hundreds of them, suffered and died throughout the whole of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian authorities, supported and egged on by our Western colleagues, didn't just rest on their laurels. Just before our special operation started, we received credible information stating that Kiev concluded preparations on a new broad-scale attack on Donbass. These plans were thwarted. We can talk of Ukrainian nationalism and inhumane speech for a long time. We decided to save your time, and we prepared a selection of statements by representatives of the official authorities of Ukraine, and also from famous and well-known popular public figures in the country. We will distribute this shortly as an official Security Council document so that you can really grasp what real hate speech is in contemporary Ukraine and how it's used to justify violence against the Russian-speaking population. I will just highlight some of the most recent Russophobic steps of the Ukrainian authorities. This is the ban on receiving an education in Russian and also on importing Russian books or studying Russian Russian literature, even as foreign literature, in Ukrainian schools and universities. I'm sure some of you will say, well, Russia itself is to blame. However, given what I've already said, these steps seem to be a logical next step of the consistent policy of the Ukrainian authorities after the Maidan coup. It is just being sped up right now. Dear colleagues, in conclusion, I'd like to underscore that despite the unfurling of boorish Russophobia and racism in Ukraine, and this is something that our African colleagues really experienced for themselves when they tried to organize an evacuation of their students in the first days of our special military operation, we still, despite this, have a positive attitude to the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian culture, and Ukrainian language. Ukraine is a brotherly, friendly people. It's just that today the leaders are introducing a foreign policy that's foreign both to us and to the Ukrainian people, foreign geopolitical agenda. Today we've heard, and I'm sure we will hear, accusations that we want to obliterate Ukraine and cauterize everything that's Ukrainian. That is absolutely not the case. We want to cauterize the flourishing neo-Nazism and nationalism in Ukraine, because of which this country has gradually turned into an anti-Russian country and thus becoming a direct threat to us and the inhabitants of Donbass. And our Western colleagues, unfortunately, are directly involved in this Ukrainian tragedy. We see from our side a real incitement to violence and Russophobia in Ukraine. The Western sponsors withdrew from the Kiev negotiation team, which was looking to a quest for solutions, vying with each other to persuade themselves that the solution can only be found on the battlefield. Josep Borrell actually spoke about this last week in the council. Moreover, the West has been pumping Ukraine with weapons, providing with long-range artillery and targeted strikes on Donbass to destroy the Russian-speaking civilian population. The US, Canada, the UK, Germany, France, Poland, Australia, Belgium, Bulgaria, Greece, Denmark, Ireland, Spain, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Romania, North Macedonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Turkey, Finlandia, the Czech Republic, Sweden, and the Baltic countries. This is a non-exhaustive list of the main supplier countries of military equipment to the Ukrainian regime to the tune of billions of dollars. Just last week, Donbass was struck by European and American weaponry, which killed 6 civilians and injured more than 30 people. Each of these countries bears direct responsibility for dragging out the Ukrainian crisis and the deaths both of civilians and of Ukrainian soldiers, shoved by corrupt Ukrainian officials to the front as cannon fodder. You're spending billions on the proxy war with Russia, down to the last Ukrainian. This itself is genuine incitement to violence from you. You also pander to rampant Russophobia in your own countries, conniving with the Poles, Czechs, and pre-Baltic inhabitants in your countries. There are posters in some shops and bars saying that they won't serve Russians. In what way is that different from racism? Let's just change the word Russian for black people or Jews. Why does such an association seem so uncomfortable to you, but you don't seem to mind when it comes to Russians? And if you don't think, what do you think about the campaign launched by Ukraine's political movers and shakers, the Cancel Russia campaign to boycott Russian writers, musicians, artists, and sportsmen? Isn't this hate speech? Incidentally, we hear this kind of speech from the representative of the Kiev regime in Security Council meetings with your backing, who offends our country, our president, and dangles threats over Russian diplomats. No, none of the Kiev backers seem to rebuff this. However hard you try, the agony of the criminal Russophobe and neo-Nazi Kiev regime is something you are just dragging out. This regime was doomed back in 2014 when it started its criminal war against its people. Millions of Ukrainians are waiting to be liberated from it, and this is shown by the treatment of Russian soldiers by those in the liberated territories. And our special military operation will be carried through completely, and its aims will be fully achieved. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I give